Why did everyone stop when she fell, but no one helped her up? Bang! The sharp crack of gunfire split the air at Fort's training ground. It was 700 hours, sunlight striking steel and sweat, the sound of soldiers proving their worth. And right in the middle of that intensity, a small woman carrying a bucket and a mop stumbled backward, her cleaning cart tipping over, bottles scattering across the concrete. Lance, broad shoulders, shaved head gleaming under the Carolina sun, stood over her, voice booming across the compound. "Get out of my way, cleaning lady." Grace hit the ground hard, the wet earth soaking through her uniform pants. Her hands trembled slightly as she caught the rolling mop handle, fingers slick with mud and detergent. Around them, 20 soldiers paused their training to watch. Laughter rippled through the ranks. Someone whistled. Someone else muttered, "What's she even doing out here?" She didn't respond, didn't even look up. She simply started collecting the scattered rags one by one, slow and methodical, her movements precise. There was no anger, no shame, just an eerie calm. Blood trickled from her knee down to the concrete. The sunlight caught it like a red thread. Sergeant Davis, hands on hips, stepped forward. "Ma'am, this is a restricted training area. You need to clear out before you get hurt." Grace rose slowly. Her light brown hair, tied in a messy bun, had come loose, curls sticking to her forehead. Her gray t-shirt clung to her back, darkened by sweat and dirt. She looked at no one in particular and said softly, "I'll be out of the way in just a moment, sir." No one noticed the faint tremor in her voice. No one saw how her eyes flicked once toward Lance, not in fear, but in recognition, like a ghost had just walked past her. For the next 30 minutes, she mopped in silence while soldiers resumed their drills. And though her body moved like a tired civilian, every motion carried something else, a rhythm too efficient, too controlled. Anyone paying attention would see the truth hidden in plain sight. But no one was watching closely enough. Her name, according to the paperwork, was Grace. Age 41. Civilian janitorial contractor. Widowed. To the personnel at Fort, she was background noise. The woman with the squeaky cart who came and went like a ghost between corridors. Her boots left faint tracks of bleach water on polished floors. Her gray t-shirt, always the same one, had faded at the seams. Her ID badge hung loose around her neck, swinging gently as she walked from hall to hall. 6 months on the base, and not one soldier had ever asked where she came from, or why she always worked late, or why she never seemed surprised by anything. Every morning at 5:30, she arrived through the civilian gate, a canvas messenger bag over her shoulder. No music, no chatter, just the rhythmic squeak of wheels and the scent of disinfectant following her wherever she went. Lance had noticed her the first day. Not because she stood out, but because she didn't. At 22, Lance was the definition of elite material, Delta Force candidate, physically dominant, tactically sharp, confident to the point of arrogance. He was the kind of soldier who filled a room without saying a word. And yet something about Grace irritated him, her silence, her calm, her refusal to react. He began with harmless jokes. "Hey, cleaning lady, you missed a spot." Then came the subtle taunts, the pointed comments when his friends were around, the not-so-accidental spills that forced her to work longer hours. By the third week, it had become routine, his dominance, her silence, the crowd's laughter. "Move faster, lady," Lance said one afternoon, deliberately walking through a wet hallway she'd just mopped. The soles of his boots left muddy prints behind him. "Some of us have real jobs that actually matter." Grace didn't flinch. She simply mopped around his boots, as if his mockery were part of the floor pattern. The water swirled gray beneath her mop head, circling the boot prints like ghosts being erased. Private Williams, a 19-year-old recruit from Tennessee, glanced between them. "Hey, maybe we should." "Should just what?" Lance cut in sharply. "Ignore security protocols because someone might get their feelings hurt. You think this is a Grace's mop continued moving in quiet rhythm. Left, right, rinse, repeat. But Williams noticed something, the way she never wasted motion, the way she seemed to know exactly where everyone was in the hallway without looking up. It wasn't random efficiency. It was awareness. Up in her office window, Dr. Sarah, the base psychologist, had been watching these interactions for months. She'd written reports, sent memos, requested interventions. Each one was ignored. Her February notes read, "Subject displays hypervigilance consistent with combat exposure. Startle reflex, spatial awareness, and threat assessment behavior inconsistent with civilian background." By March, she'd grown concerned enough to contact Personnel Command. No one responded. By April, she stopped asking questions, but she kept watching. And in those quiet hours between shifts, she began to wonder who Grace really was. Then came the cafeteria incident. It was lunchtime. The room buzzed with noise, trays clattering, laughter echoing off metal tables. Grace worked quietly near the windows, wiping down surfaces as soldiers came and went. Her sleeves were rolled to her elbows, revealing faint scars along her forearms, too neat to be accidental, too symmetrical to be random. Lance walked in carrying a tray piled high with food. He saw her and smirked. "Excuse me, cleaning lady," he said loud enough for everyone to hear. "This table's reserved for actual military personnel." Grace looked up briefly. Her green eyes met his for half a second, and then she nodded, polite, distant, submissive. She reached for her spray bottle. That's when he accidentally bumped her arm. The disinfectant spilled across the table, dripping down onto the floor. Soldiers nearby burst into laughter. Someone filmed it. "Holy hell, look what you did," Lance said, feigning disappointment. "Guess you'll have to clean that up twice." Grace dropped to her knees and began wiping the mess, paper towels soaking up the sharp smell of ammonia. The burn stung her eyes, but she didn't blink away the tears. She simply kept working. "Is she crying?" Someone called from across the room. "Nah," another replied, "it's just the cleaner." When she finally finished, she gathered her supplies and walked out. No words, no anger, just quiet footsteps fading down the hall. That night, Private Williams found himself in Doctor's office. He looked uneasy. "Ma'am," he said, "went too far today. He made her clean up what he spilled on purpose." Everyone laughed. Doctor sighed. "I've documented everything, Private, but until she files a complaint, Command won't act." Williams hesitated. "Ma'am, have you noticed anything strange about her?" "Strange how?" He scratched the back of his neck. "She moves different. Like when she's cleaning, she always knows where people are even when she's not looking. And during the fire drill yesterday, she was the first one to find the fastest exit route. Told the other civilians where to go before anyone gave orders. She even fixed Sergeant Davis's generator problem last week, said it was a fuel line issue. She was right." Doctor raised her eyebrows. "Interesting, anything else?" "She never seems surprised," Williams said quietly. "Not once, no matter what happens." That was the moment the psychologist realized Grace wasn't just a civilian. She was something else entirely. The next few weeks, Grace's behavior grew more meticulous. Her cleaning routes weren't random, they were reconnaissance. Her pauses by doorways weren't fatigue, they were surveillance checks. Her notes on supply deliveries weren't inventory, they were pattern tracking. She moved like someone waiting for something to happen. And it was coming sooner than anyone expected. By May, Lance's harassment reached a new level. He followed her from building to building, offering sarcastic commentary loud enough for everyone to hear. "Look at that, missed a spot. You ever think of applying for a real job?" He laughed, glancing toward Sergeant at a nearby desk. "You think we should really be letting civilians in classified zones? Security risk, if you ask me." That last comment froze the room. Grace paused mid-motion, her hand gripping the cloth tightly enough to whiten her knuckles. Then slowly, she looked up at him, meeting his eyes for exactly 3 seconds. It was the first time she had ever looked directly at him. And in that silence, something passed between them, something cold, electric, impossible to name. Then she turned away and resumed cleaning, her composure unbroken. But for those 3 seconds, if anyone had seen her eyes clearly, they would realize they weren't the eyes of a janitor. They were the eyes of someone who had seen death and survived it. That evening, Williams burst into Doctor's office again. He just called her a spy, he said, in front of everyone. Doctor straightened. That's a serious accusation. I know, ma'am. He said she might be collecting information. Within the hour, Doctor was on the phone with Major Stevens in personnel management. She explained the escalating behavior, the harassment, the baseless accusations. Has the civilian filed any formal complaints? Stevens asked. No, sir, not one. Then our hands are tied, Doctor. Without an official report, it's interpersonal conflict, not misconduct. Doctor hung up in frustration. Why won't she defend herself? She whispered. But Grace had her reasons, reasons no one at Fort could imagine. That night in a locked janitorial closet, Grace opened her worn canvas bag. Inside, hidden beneath folded cleaning cloths, was a black encrypted communication device. She powered it on and read the message that had been waiting for her. Angel status report confirmed. Continue protective surveillance. Principal unaware. Threat level dormant. Her hand trembled for the first time that day. Because Angel wasn't as she'd heard in years. It was hers from another life, another war. Grace wasn't a widow from Charlotte. She was Grace, former CIA operative, Special Activities Division, deep cover counterterrorism. And the man tormenting her. He was the son of the soldier who had died saving her life 18 years ago. Outside, thunder rolled across Fort. Inside that closet, Grace stared at her reflection in a small metal mirror, mud on her cheek, blood dried on her knee, exhaustion etched into every line of her face. She whispered softly, almost like a prayer. I promised him I'd keep you safe, Lance, even if you hate me for it. Then she shut the device off, tucked it back beneath the cleaning rags, and pushed her cart down the empty hallway. The wheels squeaked again, echoing through the dark like a heartbeat. Everyone saw a janitor. No one saw the guardian hiding in plain sight. And somewhere deep inside the base, under flickering fluorescent lights, a woman carried her mop like a weapon, preparing for the day her promise would be tested. Sometimes strength doesn't shout. It simply keeps its head down and endures, waiting for the right moment to rise. Why didn't anyone question how she always knew what was coming, before it happened? The base had its rhythms, reveille at dawn, training drills at 8, reports at 10, and silence by midnight. But beneath that rhythm, Grace lived in another world entirely, one built on secrets, surveillance, and ghosts that never stayed buried. By day, she mopped the hallways of Fort. By night, she monitored the living legacy of a man who had died in her arms 18 years ago. Lance. He didn't remember her. Didn't know her voice. Didn't know that when his father bled out under the Afghan sun, Grace had promised to keep his son safe, at any cost. And every time Lance mocked her, every time he shoved past her, every cruel laugh, Grace absorbed it like shrapnel, silently reminding herself, you're keeping him alive. That's what matters. The following morning, Fort buzzed with energy. Training rotations, convoy drills, weapons checks, the kind of organized chaos that kept soldiers alive overseas. Grace moved among them unnoticed, pushing her cart through corridors humming with the sound of ambition. But her eyes weren't on the floor. They were everywhere else. A handprint smudge on a door. A footprint where no one should been. A security badge left dangling too low. Details, tiny things, things no one else saw but Grace did, because in her world the smallest thing was usually the most dangerous. At 10:30 hours, Dr. Sarah stared at her computer screen. On it, several behavioral reports blinked back at her: pattern recognition logs, incident timestamps, eyewitness testimonies. All of it pointed to one conclusion she couldn't quite admit aloud. Grace didn't belong in any personnel file. Her background check was almost empty. No references, no prior addresses beyond a single apartment in Charlotte. No credit history, no family contacts. Even her social security record showed a gap, a missing decade that had simply vanished. It wasn't a gap, it was a cover. Doctor leaned back in her chair, troubled. She'd seen her share of trauma, veterans masking pain behind humor, officers drowning guilt in duty, but Grace was different. Grace wasn't broken. Grace was waiting. And the more thought about it, the more one question haunted her. Waiting for what? At the same time, across the base, Lance was doing what he did best, proving himself. He moved through the obstacle course like a storm, muscles coiled, lungs burning, sweat streaking down his neck. The other trainees admired him. He was power in motion. Discipline, aggression, and certainty wrapped into one perfect soldier. But beneath that armor of confidence lived something else, a void. The absence of a father he never really knew. A shadow he couldn't escape. He told himself he didn't care. He had the army now, the mission, the brotherhood. Still, when he saw Grace wiping down the briefing room window later that afternoon, something in him twisted. She looked fragile, pathetic even, and yet she never seemed scared. He didn't know why that bothered him. Sergeant Davis called out, "Weapons maintenance at 1400, don't be late." "Yes, sir." Lance's voice was crisp, confident. But when he turned, his eyes caught Grace again, the way she stepped aside, silent, deferential, yet not submissive. It wasn't fear. It was restraint. The same kind of restraint he'd seen in instructors who could break a man in seconds if they chose to. He shook off the thought. She's just a janitor, he told himself. Just a woman with a mop. By evening, the base cafeteria had quieted. Grace stood alone in the storage room, disinfectant fumes stinging her nose. She checked the clock. 21:43, the moment she'd been waiting for. She locked the door, pulled back the false panel behind the cleaning supplies, and retrieved her device, matte black, encrypted and pulsing with a single message notification. She read it under the flickering fluorescent light. Angel status check. Possible activity among separatists confirmed. Maintain position. Principal remains unaware. Do not break cover. Her pulse quickened. 18 years since the ambush in Kandahar, and the same name was surfacing again, separatists. She remembered their faces. The gunfire. The way Lance's father had stayed behind to hold off insurgents so she could escape with the intelligence files. She begged him to run. He'd smiled instead. "You're faster than me," he'd said. "If one of us doesn't make it, make sure they never touch my boy." That night haunted her every time she closed her eyes. And now it was happening again. The next morning, Fort woke to thunderclouds and humidity thick enough to choke on. Grace arrived early, as usual, the mop handle rattling against her cart. She greeted the gate guard with her quiet nod, passed through inspection, and entered the compound. But today, she wasn't thinking about floors or windows. She was counting faces, watching hands, tracking movement. 3 new contractors had arrived at the motor pool, Eastern European accents, unfamiliar paperwork, and matching tattoos barely hidden under their sleeves. One of them glanced at her for a second too long. Grace's instinct screamed, "They're here." But she said nothing, just kept walking. Because if she broke cover now, Lance would never believe her. And if she didn't, he'd be dead before the week was out. The storm outside matched the tension inside. Lance swaggered through the admin wing, laughing with another trainee. Grace was cleaning the glass partitions when his voice cut through the noise. "You see her, she's everywhere, creepy, right?" He smirked, turning to his buddy. "Bet she's some kind of spy." The word hit like a spark to gasoline. Every head turned. Grace froze. For a moment time held its breath. Then she looked at him. 3 seconds of silence, 3 seconds of truth. Her eyes, sharp green and steady, locked on his, and in them Lance saw something he couldn't name. Not defiance, not fear, something ancient, something that made him feel small. He looked away first. But that look changed everything. Later that evening, Doctor sat with Private Williams in her office. Rain drummed softly against the windows. "Ma'am," Williams began, "I think crossed a line." "He's been crossing lines for months," Doctor replied. No, this was different. He accused her of espionage. Set down her tablet. "That's serious." "Yes, ma'am. And I think she knows more than anyone here realizes." Studied the young soldier. "Why do you say that?" Williams hesitated. "Because she's never surprised. She knows the layout of this base better than some officers. I've seen her give directions to security personnel, and she's never been wrong. She even fixed a power issue last week by checking the backup fuel line. Who would know that unless they'd been trained?" Doctor felt her stomach tighten. "You're suggesting she's what, a plant?" "I don't know," Williams said, "but she's not who she says she is." Nodded slowly. "Then it's time someone found out." That same night, while the rain still whispered against the barracks windows, Grace sat in the janitorial supply room, reviewing her mental checklist. No contact tonight, no extraction, no signal. Everything had to remain normal. But she knew the silence was deceptive. In her line of work, quiet usually meant danger was close. She removed her gloves and stared at her hands, small, the hands of someone who'd once built explosives, patched wounds, written reports that toppled regimes. And now they scrubbed floors. Her reflection in the metal cabinet stared back at her, gray t-shirt, plain face, soft eyes that no one looked at twice. The perfect disguise. A faint sound made her pause, the crunch of gravel outside the service door. She turned off the light, moving silently toward the crack in the blinds. A van sat idling across the lot. White unmarked engine running. No visible plates. Her pulse rose, but she stayed still. After a moment, the engine cut. Two figures stepped out, one lighting a cigarette, the other checking a clipboard. Maintenance crew uniforms. But their boots were wrong, tactical grade, not contractor issue. Grace's chest tightened. They were testing access routes, mapping routines. They were here for Lance. Across the base, Sergeant Cole, a 30-year veteran, sharp-eyed, slow to trust, sat in his office reviewing security camera footage. Something about the cleaning lady bothered him. She moved too deliberately. He'd seen that kind of movement before: Afghanistan, Baghdad, covert ops, people trained to survive. He zoomed in on one frame, Grace walking through a crowded hallway. Even in still images, her awareness radiated. She was watching exits, counting heads, reading body language. He leaned back and muttered to himself, "That's not a janitor, that's an operative." He closed the feed and picked up his radio. "Doctor, we need to talk." By sunrise, the storm had passed, but the air felt heavier than before. Grace moved through the corridors, exhausted but alert. Every instinct told her the storm wasn't gone. It had just changed form. As she passed the window of the command office, she caught sight of something she wasn't meant to see: Sergeant Cole standing with Doctor, both staring at her personnel file projected on a tablet. Cole's expression was grim. Grace didn't slow down, didn't show reaction, but inside her pulse ticked faster. Her cover was cracking. And if they pulled on that thread, everything, the mission, the promise, Lance's protection would unravel. That night she returned to her small apartment off base. Bare walls, minimal furniture, no photos, no history. On the nightstand, one single keepsake, a worn dog tag engraved with the name. She picked it up, thumb tracing the etched letters. "You'd hate me if you saw me now," she whispered, pretending to be nothing. Her eyes glistened, but no tears fell. She'd run out of them long ago. Her phone buzzed once. A new message flashed on the encrypted screen. Angel possible infiltration confirmed. Hostile movement expected within 72 hours. Maintain proximity to principal. Protect at all costs. Grace exhaled slowly, steadying her heartbeat. The hunt was on, and the predators had no idea their target had been guarded by one of the deadliest protectors alive. The next morning, as soldiers gathered for formation, Grace was already there, pushing her cart past the line of recruits, invisible as ever. Her gaze drifted briefly toward Lance, laughing among his peers. He looked so much like his father in that moment, same jawline, same spark in his eyes. Her hand brushed the dog tag hidden beneath her shirt. "I promised you," she murmured under her breath, "and I keep my promises." The mop squeaked softly against the tile as she disappeared down the hall, leaving behind the faint scent of bleach, and the whisper of something no one on base could name. The janitor was watching. The hunter was waiting. And the countdown had begun. Sometimes the people who seem the smallest are carrying the heaviest secrets, and when the storm finally breaks, they're the ones who stand unshaken. What happens when the quietest person in the room becomes the most dangerous one there? Morning broke over Fort with a stillness that didn't feel right. The air was heavy, the kind of quiet that settles before something breaks. Grace, still known to everyone as Grace, the janitor, pushed her cleaning cart down the polished hallways. The rhythmic squeak of its wheels echoed softly, almost like a metronome counting down time. Her hands moved mechanically, but her mind was racing. 3 unmarked vans had entered the base the day before. 3 groups of contractors. And no one but her noticed that they didn't act like roofers or electricians. They acted like a team moving under orders. Her instincts screamed, "They're not here to fix anything." They were here for a name. Dr. Sarah's office lights glowed faintly through the misted morning air. She hadn't slept much. The more she reviewed Grace's behavioral files, the more the pieces refused to fit the official story. Hypervigilance, rapid stress recovery, tactical situational awareness. This wasn't civilian behavior. It was military intelligence conditioning. Grace didn't have trauma, she had training. And if Doctor's hunch was right, the woman everyone had ignored for months was operating under a cover so deep, no one on base even had clearance to know it existed. Still without proof, was trapped in bureaucracy. So she called someone who didn't care much for protocol, Master Sergeant Cole. Cole was old school. 30 years in uniform. He'd seen heroes, cowards, liars, and ghosts, sometimes all in the same man. When Doctor called, his answer was simple. "Meet me at the observation room in 20 minutes. Bring everything you've got." The two of them sat side by side watching security footage from the past 3 weeks. No sound, just Grace, moving through the base like a shadow. Cole leaned forward, "Pause it there." Grace, pushing her cart, stepped aside as 2 soldiers passed. Her eyes never moved directly toward them, but her shoulders shifted slightly, just enough to give herself a clean reaction line, a tactical habit drilled into operatives who expected attack from anywhere. Cole shook his head slowly. "That's trained muscle memory. No janitor does that." Doctor exhaled, whispering what they both knew. "She's not who she says she is." Cole didn't smile. "The question is, who is she really?" Meanwhile, Grace was already aware they were watching her. It was in the way Dr. eyes lingered too long during hallway greetings. The subtle changes in guard rotations. The sense of eyes on her back whenever she turned a corner. She expected this day, just not so soon. She paused outside the admin building, pretending to adjust her mop handle. In the reflection of the window, she caught Sergeant Cole standing near the far corridor, pretending to read his tablet, but his gaze wasn't on the screen. It was on her. She didn't panic. Instead, she smiled faintly, the kind of smile that said, "You're late to the truth." Then she turned, continuing her rounds. Lance hadn't seen Grace since the cafeteria incident. He didn't feel guilty, not yet. But something about her stuck in his mind lately. That moment when she'd looked at him, those 3 silent seconds haunted him. There was power in her stillness, like a soldier deciding whether or not to strike. And that tattoo, he swore he'd seen a flash of something inked beneath her collar once. A shape, a shadow. But he'd laughed it off. She's a cleaner, he'd told himself. What could she possibly be hiding? He didn't know that his question would soon become the last peaceful thought he'd have for a long time. By late afternoon, Sergeant Cole couldn't keep quiet anymore. He entered Doctor's office carrying a secure tablet and closed the door behind him. "Doctor, I've got something." He projected several still images on the wall, surveillance clips, showing Grace moving through restricted zones where civilian access wasn't authorized. Frowned. How did she even get into those areas? Cole folded his arms. That's the thing, she didn't force anything. Every door she passed through was already open within seconds of her arrival. Timing that precise doesn't happen by accident. He pointed to another frame. "See this? Watch how she positions herself, always with a clean line to exits, always an angle to observe personnel. That's textbook protective surveillance." Looked at him, protective surveillance, as in she's guarding someone, Cole finished. There was silence for a moment, the kind that stretches too long. "Who?" asked softly. Cole's jaw tightened. "That's what I'm trying to figure out." The same evening, Grace sat alone in the janitor's closet, a small light illuminating the encrypted device in her lap. She had only one message queued to send, but she hesitated before pressing transmit. To Handler SULLIVN. Subject: base compromise potential. My cover may not hold. Recommend standby extraction. Hostile contractor presence confirmed. She stared at the blinking cursor, thinking of Lance. If she requested extraction, he'd lose his protection. If she stayed, she risked exposure, and exposure could get them both killed. Her hand hovered over the send button. Then she deleted the message. Not yet, not until she was sure. The next morning, Grace's instincts flared again. At 5:45, the same white vans rolled through the civilian contractor gate. She was wiping down the admin windows when she saw them. 3 men stepping out, splitting into pairs, their eyes scanning rooftops and building corners like professionals conducting reconnaissance. Grace's stomach tightened. Her encrypted device buzzed twice in her pocket, the silent signal she'd been dreading. She ducked into a supply room and checked the screen. Angel chatter confirmed. Hostile infiltration likely. Maintain eyes on principal. Do not engage until confirmation. She looked out the small window and saw Lance heading toward the training grounds. He was the principal, the protected asset. And the threat was now walking the same base as him. Across the compound, Doctor and Sergeant Cole were mid-conversation when the first real cracks appeared in the illusion. Cole had just shown her additional footage, Grace, using a janitor's badge to access the motor pool building minutes before an unlogged equipment check. But what caught attention wasn't the access, it was her hands. The way she handled the heavy metal door fast, efficient, like she'd done it 1,000 times before. "That's not guessing," whispered. "She knows this place like she built it." Cole turned off the footage and exhaled. I'm telling you, she's here for a reason. And after 30 years in this job, my gut says it's not against us. Looked up, you think she's protecting someone? Cole nodded once. Yeah, but who and from what? Before either of them could answer, the base intercom crackled, a distorted voice echoing through every hallway. Security alert. Civilian contractors arriving early for clearance verification. Proceed with standard protocol. Cole's eyes narrowed. Verification my ass. Those vans have been here all week. He reached for his sidearm and started for the door. Grace was already in motion. She ditched the cart, pulled off her gloves, and walked straight toward the service stairwell. Her pulse was steady, her breathing controlled. Every cell in her body was shifting back to the person she used to be, the one she'd buried to live a quiet, invisible life. The agent. The hunter. The protector. She reached the second-floor landing and stopped. Footsteps echoed below. Two men, speaking softly in Russian. Her Russian was fluent, though she hadn't spoken it in years. Check the training schedule. Confirm location by 800. Her blood ran cold. She pressed herself against the wall, silent as stone, until they passed. Then she moved in the opposite direction, eyes scanning for a vantage point. She needed to confirm how many there were and how close they were willing to get to her principal. At 7:40, Lance was on the training field, adjusting his gear for the morning's live exercise. He joked with his team, unaware of anything unusual. Nearby, Grace observed from the maintenance building, pretending to clean the windows but tracking every motion. The contractors were no longer pretending. One stood near the rooftop access ladder. Another disappeared inside with a long case, too long for tools, too short for standard gear. Grace's instincts into certainty. They're setting up a shooting position. She tapped her earpiece, a tiny covert comm device disguised as an earplug. Her handler's voice came through, low and urgent. Angel, confirm visual on principal. Confirmed. Hostiles. 6 split into 3 pairs, moving into position. Engagement authorization pending. Negative, Grace whispered. Too close to civilians, I'll handle it. She cut the channel before could argue. Back in the command center, Sergeant Cole was about to initiate a formal background check on Grace when his terminal flickered. For a brief moment, her file disappeared, replaced by a single word stamped in red across the screen. Classified level black. Cole froze. He'd never seen that designation before, not even during joint ops with CIA or NSA teams. Doctor, he said slowly, you might want to see this. Peered over his shoulder. What does it mean? It means we're not supposed to know who she is, Cole said grimly. And if she's operating on this base under level black clearance. He looked up, realization dawning. Then, whatever's about to happen isn't a coincidence. Outside, the sky had turned white with heat. The training field shimmered in sunlight. Grace moved through the maintenance tunnels, silent, invisible, closing in on the first sniper position. Her movements were surgical, every step placed for balance, every breath measured. When she emerged near the upper scaffolding, she caught sight of a man assembling a rifle, a custom, suppressed, designed for covert assassinations. Her stomach clenched. Lance's team was moving into formation below, seconds from stepping into the kill zone. Grace tightened her grip on the pipe she carried as a makeshift weapon. She had one choice: break cover or watch a promise die. At that exact moment, Sergeant Cole's radio erupted with static. Sir, unknown civilian activity near the North Tower. Looks like. He never finished. 3 sharp pops cracked the air, not from training ammo, real gunfire. Cole's head snapped toward the window. Oh God, it started. He bolted for the door, Dr. Wright behind him. And in that moment, Grace made her move. Fast, silent, precise. Her attack on the first sniper was swift, a strike to the throat, a disarm, a controlled descent. 15 seconds, no gunfire, no noise. But when she looked across the training yard, she saw the second sniper adjusting his aim, not at Lance this time, but at her. He'd seen her. Grace ducked, adrenaline flooding her veins. Her cover was gone. Every soldier in that yard would see who she really was before the day was over. In the seconds before the first bullet struck, she thought of his blood on her hands, of the child he'd begged her to protect. And she whispered into the wind, "Forgive me for breaking cover." Then she ran straight toward the gunfire. Sometimes the truth hides in plain sight, and when it finally steps into the light, the world never looks the same again. What would you do if the person you'd mocked for months turned out to be the one keeping you alive? The first real bullet cracked through the air at 8:27 hours. It didn't sound like training ammunition. It sounded heavier, sharper, final. Lance's head snapped toward the sound. "That wasn't sim rounds," he muttered, instinctively dropping to one knee. Around him, trainees froze mid-drill. Then came the second shot. And the third. Chaos rippled through the training yard as the echo of gunfire bounced off concrete walls. From the observation deck, Sergeant Davis shouted, "Cease fire, cease fire, check your weapons." But the sound wasn't coming from them. Somewhere above the Mock City training zone, someone else was firing. And one person, one woman, was already running toward it. Grace, still wearing her gray janitor's shirt, sprinted across the gravel lot, her boots slamming into the ground with the precision of a soldier who'd done this before. She wasn't running away from the sound of gunfire. She was running toward it. To the men watching from below, it made no sense. To Grace, it was instinct, the kind burned into her soul 18 years ago in the sand and smoke of Afghanistan. She scaled the side maintenance ladder in seconds, moving faster than she had any right to. Her movements were smooth, fluid, practiced. By the time she reached the upper platform, she could see him. A man in a contractor's vest, assembling a suppressed sniper rifle, barrel already fixed on the field below. Lance was in his crosshairs. Grace didn't hesitate. She moved, silent as shadow. In one motion, she stepped behind him, gripped the barrel, twisted, and drove her elbow into his jaw. The strike was surgical. Bone snapped, the rifle clattered, and the man collapsed. Grace caught him before he hit the floor, lowered him gently, and disengaged the safety on the rifle. 15 seconds. One hostile down. 5 more to go. But before she could reposition, she saw movement across the yard, the glint of another rifle muzzle, sunlight catching steel. The second sniper had spotted her. And now she was the target. The first bullet ripped through the railing beside her, sparks exploding like fireworks. Grace dropped low, heart pounding but face calm. She lived this before: ambushes, kill zones, the sound of death cutting air. Her eyes tracked the second sniper, 200 meters away, elevated, hidden behind construction scaffolding. She could see his scope glinting faintly in the morning light. He was adjusting his aim. Not at Lance anymore. At her. Grace inhaled. The decision came instantly. Draw his fire. By Lance time. She took a deep breath, then broke from cover. Down below, soldiers screamed as the cleaning lady they'd ignored for months suddenly ran across the training field, moving with professional, tactical precision. She sprinted low, using cover between concrete barriers, her path direct and deliberate. "What the hell is she doing?" Sergeant Davis yelled. Private Williams, frozen behind a barricade, whispered, "That's not how a janitor runs." Lance turned, spotting her just as the sniper opened fire again. 3 rounds slammed into the ground where she'd been seconds earlier, dust exploding into the air. Grace dove behind another barrier, rolled, and came up with the captured rifle in hand. The soldiers watching from below couldn't believe what they were seeing. Her stance solid, her posture textbook combat shooting form, her eyes focused, unshaken. Lance stared. "She's returning fire," he whispered. That's military." From the command center, alarms blared as Colonel received fragmented radio chatter. Unknown civilian engaged in firefight. Possible hostile infiltration. Shots fired inside live training zone. He barked into the comm, "Lock the base down, identify that civilian." But when the first drone camera feed came online, showing a woman in gray shirt and dark pants firing with lethal precision, Colonel froze. He recognized that form, that calm, that control. "Impossible," he murmured. "Is that Agent Angel?" Back on the training field, the battle intensified. Grace climbed toward the scaffolding, moving through narrow access tunnels built for maintenance workers, not soldiers. She moved fast, silently, as the sound of the sniper's rifle echoed nearby. When she emerged from the lower hatch, she was directly behind him. He never heard her coming. She grabbed the barrel, wrenched it sideways, and struck 2 hits, one to the throat, one to the temple. He collapsed instantly. But the struggle ripped her shoulder open, a burst of fabric, a flash of pain. And with that tear, the truth slipped free. Beneath the shredded collar of her shirt, sunlight revealed a tattoo, black ink against pale skin, right across her neck and shoulder blades. The men below could see it through binoculars and scopes. A winged skull, 2 crossed rifles, and a banner wrapped beneath it with a name. "Lar." Lance froze. For a second, the entire world went silent. He stared at the tattoo, heart pounding. That name, R, it couldn't be real. It was his father's name. The man who died in Kandahar, before Lance was even old enough to understand what war was. "R," he whispered, his voice shaking, "that's my father's name." Everything inside him broke at once. The mockery, the cruelty, the months of disrespect toward her. The woman he dismissed as a janitor, as worthless, was wearing his father's name across her skin. More gunfire tore through the scaffolding. The remaining operatives had realized their plan was collapsing. 2 of them opened automatic fire, sweeping the upper platforms. Grace ducked, returning controlled bursts from the sniper rifle, dropping one of them instantly. Blood sprayed across the metal grating, the echo sharp and final. But one bullet caught her in the shoulder. She stumbled, pain blooming red against gray cloth, but didn't stop. She chambered another round, aimed and fired again. Silence. Both hostiles down. Below, soldiers began advancing cautiously, securing the perimeter. Sergeant Davis shouted orders, "Get her down, secure that area." But Lance wasn't listening. He broke cover and ran straight into the chaos. Someone yelled, "Get back." He ignored them. All he could think about was the tattoo, the name, the unbearable realization forming in his chest. He reached the scaffolding just as Grace descended, one arm clutching her bleeding shoulder. She looked at him, exhausted, wounded but calm. For the first time, he saw her eyes without hatred between them. And he saw recognition. "Who are you?" he demanded, voice cracking. "How do you know my father?" Grace's lips parted. Her breathing was shallow, blood streaking down her arm. "Your father," she said quietly, "saved my life in Afghanistan." Lance froze. "He died protecting me," she continued. "And before he did, he made me promise to protect his son." Her voice trembled just slightly. "I've been keeping that promise for 18 years. The words hit him like a punch. He staggered back, shaking his head, unable to process it. Everything, all the months of humiliation he'd inflicted, the cruel laughter, the ignorance flooded his mind. You've been protecting me, his voice cracked, all this time. Grace nodded. And his voice broke completely. I've been the threat you endured. A tear rolled down his cheek. I'm sorry, God, I'm so sorry. Grace reached up, gently touching his face with her bloodied hand. You have nothing to apologize for, Lance. You were doing what your father taught you to do, protect your team, be cautious of strangers. Her eyes softened. You were the soldier he wanted you to be. Around them, chaos continued, soldiers shouting, medics arriving, security locking down the perimeter. But inside that small bubble of understanding, everything was quiet. Lance looked at her, truly seeing her for the first time. Not as a cleaner, not as a civilian, but as someone who had carried his father's promise longer than he'd been alive. You were there, he whispered, when he died. Grace nodded slowly. I held him, she said. He gave me the intel that saved hundreds of lives, but before he let go, he made me promise, make sure my son grows up safe. Her voice broke. I couldn't save him, but I could save you. The base security teams finally reached them. Colonel himself arrived, surrounded by armed personnel. When he saw Grace, wounded but standing, he stopped cold. Agent Angel, he said quietly, voice filled with disbelief. You're supposed to be dead. Grace smiled faintly. Not yet, sir. Agent Angel, Lance repeated, turning to her. That's your real name. It's my call sign, she said softly. Grace, Special Activities Division, CIA. The soldiers exchanged stunned looks. The cleaning woman they'd mocked was a living legend, the Agent Angel, the woman who had extracted critical intelligence from Kandahar in 2007 and vanished into deep cover afterward. Lance's mouth went dry. You're a hero. Grace's smile faded. Heroes don't hide behind mops. Medics approached, urging her to sit, but Grace waved them off. Later, secure the area first. There were 6. 2 remain unaccounted for. Even bleeding, she was still giving orders, steady, unflinching. Every word carried authority. Watched her, all mixing with regret. You've been on this base for months, he said, under our noses. Protective surveillance assignment, Grace replied. Target, Lance, your base wasn't the mission, he was. Exhaled, shaking his head, all this time. Grace's voice softened. His father died for me, sir. I owed him this much. Lance couldn't speak, couldn't even breathe right. He knelt beside her, tears blurring his vision. You let me treat you like garbage for months. Why? She looked at him with tired, forgiving eyes. Because that's what your father would done, she said gently. He would endured it if it meant keeping someone else safe. She reached out and squeezed his hand. You're alive, Lance. That's all that ever mattered. He choked back a sob. I don't deserve your forgiveness. Grace smiled faintly through her exhaustion. You don't need it. You already have it. Colonel's radio crackled with new orders. Perimeter secure. Hostiles neutralized. No further threats detected. The colonel looked back at Grace, then at the soldiers watching silently nearby. Agent Angel, he said quietly, his voice thick with emotion. Welcome home. Around them, soldiers began to lower their weapons, realization spreading like wildfire. The janitor, the ghost, the woman they'd ignored for half a year, was the reason Fort was still standing. Lance helped her to her feet. Her blood smeared across his sleeve, dark and warm. In that moment, it didn't matter who was soldier and who was protector. They were family bound by a promise, sealed by sacrifice. Grace looked at him, one last time before the medics led her away. Your father would be proud, she whispered. Lance nodded, tears still falling. So am I. And as she was carried toward the waiting vehicle, the sun broke through the morning clouds, washing the field in gold. No one looked at her the same way again. Sometimes dignity doesn't shout. It bleeds quietly, keeps its promise, and walks away before the world even realizes it was there. How do you go back to mopping floors after the world finds out you saved it? 3 days after the firefight, Fort was silent again. But it wasn't the same kind of silence as before. It was heavier, full of eyes that lingered, whispers that stopped when she passed. Grace sat in the infirmary, her shoulder wrapped in fresh bandages. She'd refused morphine, said it dulled her focus. The nurse, a young corporal, avoided asking questions. Everyone on base had seen the footage by now, the janitor who'd taken down an armed infiltration team, the woman with the tattoo that carried a dead soldier's name. To most, she was a myth come to life. To herself, she was just tired. The door opened with a quiet click. Colonel stepped in, his expression unreadable, not anger, not admiration, something in between. He stood by her bedside for a moment, then set a manila file on the table. "Officially," he said, "you don't exist." Grace gave a small, wry smile. "That's the point, sir." He exhaled through his nose. "You saved 6 lives that day, probably more." Her gaze stayed fixed on the floor. "I failed too." Nodded. He'd read the reports. 2 hostiles escaped before the perimeter closed. He took a seat beside her. "The agency's taking you off active field cover," he said. "Langley wants a full debrief." Grace looked up at him. "When?" "Tomorrow. A chopper will take you to then D.C." He hesitated. "They also want to know why you didn't report the infiltration sooner." She didn't answer immediately. Then softly, "Because I didn't have proof yet. And if I was wrong, the one I was protecting would have been the first casualty." Her tone was calm, but her eyes betrayed exhaustion, the kind that doesn't come from physical pain, but from carrying a secret too long. Watched her for a moment, then said quietly, "You did right, Agent, even when no one saw you." Grace gave a faint smile. "That's the job, sir." Meanwhile, across the base, Lance sat on a bench near the memorial wall. Rain fell lightly, a thin, steady drizzle that blurred the engraved names. He'd been there for an hour, staring at one in particular. His father, the man he'd idealized but never really understood. And now, the woman he'd disrespected for months turned out to be the one who'd held that man's hand in his final breath. Lance didn't know what to feel: guilt, shame, disbelief. They all mixed together until he felt hollow. Sergeant Davis approached quietly, sitting beside him. He didn't speak right away, just let the rain fill the silence. Finally, Davis said, "They say she's going to D.C. tomorrow. CIA wants her back." Lance nodded absently. "Yeah." "You seen her since it happened?" He shook his head. "No." "You should," Davis said. "Some things can't wait." Later that evening, Grace stood by the barracks gate, watching the rain shimmer under the security lights. The base looked peaceful again, like nothing had happened. But the ghosts were still there. They always were. She was about to turn back inside when she heard footsteps behind her. "Grace." The voice was hesitant, uncertain. She turned. Lance stood there in full uniform, rain darkening the fabric. His expression carried too many emotions to name. She didn't speak, neither did he. For a moment, the only sound was the rain between them. Then he stepped closer. "They told me you're leaving." "I am. To D.C." "Langley," she corrected quietly. "Debrief, evaluation, reclassification, the usual." He nodded, looking down at the wet ground. "I just wanted to say." He stopped, searching for the words. "I was wrong about you." Grace tilted her head slightly. "About what?" "Everything," he said, voice cracking. "I judged you without knowing who you were. I thought you were less, and you were the one saving my life the whole time." Her eyes softened. "You were young. Soldiers learn hard lessons young." "I treated you like dirt," he said, shaking his head. "You had every reason to walk away." Grace gave a faint, tired smile. If I walked away, you wouldn't be here right now." The silence that followed wasn't awkward. It was heavy, honest. For the first time, Lance looked at her and didn't see a cleaner or a ghost. He saw strength, quiet, battered, and real. "Why my father?" he asked finally. "Why carry his name? You could just walked away after the war." Grace looked at him for a long moment, then turned her gaze toward the rain-soaked horizon. "Because he believed people like me could change," she said softly. "He saw something worth saving when the rest of the world saw a weapon." Her eyes grew distant. "He died believing in mercy, so I tried to live by it." Lance's throat tightened, "And I became the man who mocked that mercy." She looked back at him. "No, you became a soldier who didn't know the whole story. Now you do." He blinked hard, tears mixing with rain. "I don't know how to make it right." "You don't," she said simply. "You move forward, and you make your father's name mean something again." That night, long after she returned to her quarters, Grace sat alone on the narrow bed. The bandage on her shoulder itched, but she didn't move to scratch it. She just stared at the small dog tag on her nightstand's tag, and the faded envelope beside it. Inside was a single letter she'd written over a decade ago but never sent. She unfolded it, reading the words silently. "To the boy I've never met. If you're reading this, your father kept his promise. If I'm alive, it means I kept mine. He was brave, kinder than most of us deserved, and the world is smaller without him. If I ever get to meet you, I hope you're nothing like me, but everything like him. Ajay." She folded it back slowly, slipping it into her jacket pocket. Maybe it was time to give it to him. The next morning, the helicopter's blades cut through the dawn mist. Grace walked across the tarmac, escorted by Colonel and a pair of agents in civilian suits. The base personnel watched silently, no ceremony, no applause, just quiet respect. Lance stood near the hangar, hands in his pockets. When she approached, he straightened. "You didn't have to come," she said softly. "I did," he replied. "You were my father's last mission, now you're mine." She almost smiled. "You're not done yet, learn leadership first, then we'll talk missions." He reached into his pocket, pulling out a folded cloth, the torn patch from her uniform, stained with her blood. "I found this after the fight," he said. "I think it belongs to you." She took it, staring at it for a moment, the simple gray fabric, the faint mark of her old call sign. Then she shook her head. "No, keep it. A reminder that strength doesn't always look like a gun." He swallowed hard. "You really think I can be what he was?" Her eyes softened. "No, you can be better." He blinked, unable to speak. Before he could find words, the rotor wash from the helicopter picked up, whipping their jackets and hair in a storm of dust and wind. Grace turned, stepping toward the waiting aircraft. "Grace," he shouted over the roar. She turned back. "Will I see you again?" Her eyes met his through the rising dust. "Maybe," she called back, "if you ever make Colonel." He almost laughed, but the lump in his throat was too thick. The helicopter lifted, the sound of the rotors fading into the pale morning light. And with it, the woman who'd lived in shadows disappeared once more into the clouds. That night Lance sat in his barracks room, unable to sleep. He pulled open his desk drawer and found the letter Grace had slipped there earlier that day, sealed, no name written outside. He opened it carefully. "Lance, your father believed in the kind of courage that doesn't seek recognition, the kind that mops floors when it has to, carries scars without explanation, and still chooses mercy when vengeance would be easier. I saw that courage in you, even when you didn't see it in yourself. Take care of the men under you, earn their trust, lead like your father did, quietly with conviction. I'll be watching from somewhere, making sure you stay alive. Ajay." He read it 3 times. Then he folded it, slid it into his uniform pocket and whispered, "I won't let you down." Back in Washington, Grace stood before a two-way mirror, answering the same questions she'd answered her entire life. When did you first identify the threat? Why didn't you break cover sooner? What was your relationship with? Each answer was calm, controlled. But when the final question came, would you return to field duty if requested? She hesitated for the first time. She thought of Lance, of the rain, of the way his voice had cracked when he said, "I'm sorry." Then she said softly, "Yes, but not for the agency, for the people who still need protecting." Weeks later, Fort returned to routine. The world moved on. But some things had changed. In the hallway of the admin wing, a new framed photo hung quietly beside the service plaques, a candid still from security footage. Grace, covered in dust and blood, standing guard over a fallen trainee. No caption, no medal, just a single line etched beneath it. Sometimes, the quietest one in the room is the reason everyone else survives. And somewhere across the world, in another classified facility, Grace opened a sealed folder marked with a single name, her next assignment. She smiled faintly. The world never runs out of things worth protecting. Because sometimes, the heroes who save us aren't the ones with rank or medals. They're the ones who clean up the mess and never tell anyone they were there. How do you move forward when your purpose was built on someone else's death? The file landed on Grace's desk like a whisper of inevitability. Manila folder, no markings except for one name printed across the tab. Operation Dagger. It had been 6 weeks since Ford. 6 weeks since she'd bled through her shirt, revealed her tattoo, and walked out of the shadows she'd lived in for nearly 2 decades. The agency had offered her retirement, an apartment, a pension, peace. But peace wasn't something Grace knew how to live with. So she stayed. Her new handler, a thin, quiet man named, stood by the door. "You sure you want to do this again?" he asked. "You've earned the right to disappear." Grace didn't look up. Disappearing easy, living with it is. She opened the folder. Inside were 3 photographs, satellite images of a compound deep in Eastern Europe, marked with infrared traces of movement. Next to them, a grainy still of a man's face. Early 40s, scar above the eye. Yes. Grace's jaw tightened. She knew that name. He'd been there in Kandahar, part of the separatist group responsible for his death. And now he was alive. Meanwhile, back at Fort, Lance had changed. He still trained hard, still laughed with his team, but the arrogance was gone. He carried himself differently now, not louder but steadier. The others noticed. He no longer mocked the slow or the weak. He no longer joked about the janitor. In fact, he hadn't spoken her name once, but he carried her letter everywhere, folded neatly in his breast pocket, the edges soft from rereading. When his fellow trainee, Private Morales, complained about long hours, Lance had simply said, "Someone once told me strength doesn't always look like a gun. It looks like staying when everyone else quits." He didn't mention Grace, but he didn't have to. They all knew who he meant. One evening after drills, Sergeant Davis called him over. "Got something for you." He handed over a sealed envelope. No sender name, just his initials scrawled on the back. Lance frowned, opening it carefully. Inside was a short note, written in familiar, precise handwriting. "Still alive, still working. Stay sharp, soldier." A G. No address, no date, just that. He read it twice before realizing his hands were shaking. She was out there somewhere. And for reasons he didn't understand, that one line meant more than any medal ever could. Across the ocean, Grace sat in a small outside Warsaw, assembling her equipment. Every piece had its place: compact pistol, encrypted phone, old field notebook. The tools hadn't changed, but she had. She moved slower now, more careful. Time had carved something softer into her, not weakness but perspective. Entered, checking his watch. Your contact, waiting 2 clicks east. You sure you don't want backup? Grace shook her head. Ghosts don't travel in pairs. Half smiled, still quoting your old handler. He wasn't wrong, she said quietly. We haunt, we vanish, that's the job. Then she pulled on her jacket and stepped out into the cold. The meet took place in a crumbling industrial park, rows of rusted containers and broken windows. Grace approached slowly, her boots crunching over gravel. A tall man stepped from the shadows, coat collar turned up against the wind. He looked older than his photo, but the scar over his right eye hadn't changed. Her voice was calm. You shouldn't be alive. He smiled faintly. Neither should you. They stood there, a few feet apart, 2 remnants of the same war, now meeting in the quiet ruins it left behind. You were there, Grace said softly. Kandahar, you gave the order that killed. Smile didn't fade. And you shot my brother in the sand when he tried to surrender. Grace's jaw tightened. He was holding a detonator. Still, said, stepping closer, we both lost something that day. She didn't move. This isn't about the past. No, he said, it's about the promises we made to ghosts. He dropped a small flash drive on the ground between them. You'll want this. Grace didn't pick it up immediately. What's on it? Evidence, he said. Something bigger than either of us. Your agency has enemies on both sides now. Why give it to me? He smirked. Because the ones coming after me, they're coming after you too, and I prefer the devil I know. Before she could respond, headlights flared behind him, 2 SUVs approaching fast. His expression hardened. They found me. Grace reacted first. She grabbed the drive, ducked behind cover, and drew her weapon. Gunfire erupted, the sharp, professional kind, suppressed rounds. 3 shooters, closing in from the left flank. Grace returned fire with precision, dropping one. Went down behind a container, shouting, their agency. Grace froze mid-motion. What? He looked at her, bleeding from the shoulder. Your people, they sent them to erase me. And now you. She didn't want to believe it, but as one of the attackers shouted into his comm, she heard the words clear as day. Target Angel confirmed. Terminate and recover. Her own code name. They weren't here for. They were here for her. The firefight stretched for minutes that felt like hours. Grace moved like a ghost, rolling, shooting, vanishing between cover. The attackers were good, she was better. By the time it was over, 3 men lay still and was unconscious but breathing. She crouched beside him, pressing her hand over his wound. You're coming with me. He managed a weak grin. You're a terrible negotiator. She gave a faint smile. I'm not negotiating. She hoisted him up, half dragging him toward the waiting van she'd parked a block away. As she drove into the night, her thoughts spun in silence. The agency had sent a kill team for her. Someone had decided she knew too much, or had outlived her usefulness. Either way, she was marked now, again. Back in the States, Lance was summoned to the command office. Colonel stood waiting, expression grave. He said, we've received a classified update from Langley. Agent Angel's gone dark. Lance felt his chest tighten. Gone dark how? Off-grid, no comms for 72 hours, no contact. Lance clenched his fists. Then send someone. Shook his head. It's not our jurisdiction anymore. She's under agency command. Sir, with respect, Lance said, stepping forward. If she's gone dark, she's in trouble. His voice softened. I know, son, but there's nothing you can do. Lance's voice dropped to a whisper. There's always something. 2 nights later, Grace hid in an abandoned farmhouse outside. Her shoulder throbbed from shrapnel. His wound was worse. She sterilized the cut with shaking hands, her movements mechanical. You could left me, murmured through gritted teeth. Could, she said, didn't. He gave a weak laugh. You sound like him. She looked up sharply. Who? He said, the man who stayed behind. Grace froze. His eyes softened. He didn't die easy, you know. He fought like a lion. When the explosion hit, he looked at me before he went, told me to tell his boy he was proud. Her throat tightened. You never told him. His gaze drifted away, until now. Grace finished bandaging him and stood. Rest, we move at dawn. He smiled faintly, still giving orders. Still breathing, she replied. Hours later, in the half-light of dawn, Grace sat on the steps of the farmhouse, watching frost form on the grass. She pulled out her old satellite phone, the one had issued her, and stared at the signal light. It blinked red. Compromised. She thought of Lance, his father's eyes, the way he'd said, "You were the one saving my life the whole time." She wondered if he'd ever forgive her for what might come next. Because this time, she wasn't sure she'd make it back. She switched on the recorder and spoke softly. If this message reaches Langley or Fort, tell Lance I'm not running. But if the agency wants me erased, they'd better bring enough ghosts to bury me twice. She ended the recording and slid the device into her jacket pocket. Then she whispered, almost to herself, because I've already died once. Back at Fort, Lance couldn't sleep. Every instinct screamed that Grace was alive, but in danger. He'd started studying covert operations manuals, old agency procedures, even flight logs from overseas training grounds. He wasn't trying to play spy. He was trying to understand her world, the invisible one that existed beneath the surface of his. And the more he learned, the more he realized. The woman he'd once mocked wasn't superhuman. She was just human, but braver than anyone he'd ever met. At dawn, Grace drove through a snowstorm, the van rattling on the cracked road, was asleep in the back, pale from blood loss. In the mirror, she caught her own reflection, weary eyes, scars, the faint trace of the tattoo that had given her away. She touched it gently. She whispered, I kept my promise once, looks like I'm keeping it again. The radio crackled, a distorted voice breaking through the static. Agent Angel, this is command, stand down. You're considered compromised. Do not proceed further. Grace smiled bitterly. Copy that, she said, but I was compromised the day I started caring. She switched the radio off and kept driving. Because once you've lived your life in the shadows, the only thing scarier than dying is being seen for who you truly are. What happens when the protector becomes the target? Snow whipped through the trees like shrapnel, cutting visibility to a blur. Grace drove through it, one hand on the wheel, the other pressing against her bleeding shoulder. Every breath stung. Every heartbeat felt like a countdown. Was still alive in the back seat, barely conscious. The flash drive he'd given her lay on the dashboard, the key to something she didn't yet understand. But she knew one thing. Whatever was on it, someone in her own agency was willing to kill for it. The irony wasn't lost on her. The same system she'd spent her life protecting had now signed her death warrant. In Langley's secure comms center, stared at the red blinking icon on his monitor. Agent Angel, active, COMPROMICD. He rubbed his temples. The orders had come from above his clearance, level Omega authorization, direct from the directorate. Terminate with prejudice, no retrieval. He'd seen plenty of those before, usually for double agents, traitors, people who'd sold secrets. But not for her, never for her. He typed a coded message, hesitated, and then hit send. To L. You didn't get this from me. She's alive. Poland near, coordinates attached. If you go after her, you go alone. Make your father proud. Yes. At Fort, Lance read the message 3 times before believing it was real. He didn't think, he just moved. By the time anyone realized he was gone, He was already halfway to the airstrip. He'd borrowed a cargo plane under a maintenance pretext and loaded what little gear he had at cold-weather fatigues, rations, one pistol. No orders, no backup. Just a promise. He stared at the map glowing faintly on his tablet, red dot flashing deep in Eastern Europe. He thought of her last words on the tarmac. "You can be better." He whispered to himself, "Then I'll prove it." And the plane lifted off into the night. Back in the storm, Grace's engine coughed, a sputtering sound that made her jaw tighten. She pulled the van to a stop, killed the headlights, and listened. Nothing but the wind. She was running on fumes and time. Stirred behind her, voice faint. "You can leave me, save yourself." Grace shook her head. "Not my style." He gave a dry laugh, still keeping promises to dead men. She looked at him, her tone soft. "That's all I've ever done." She stepped out, crunching through the snow toward the tree line. Her instincts flared. The silence was wrong. Too still, too deliberate. Then she saw it, faint heat signatures through the fog. Drones, 3 of them, hunting pattern. She muttered under her breath, "They found us." The first explosion tore through the trees behind them, a flash of orange in the white storm. Grace dove back into the van, slammed the ignition, and floored the pedal. The tires screamed against the ice, fishtailing as the headlights cut through the snow. "Hold on," she warned. Groaned, "You call this holding on?" Machine gun fire raked the back of the van, tracers lighting the darkness. Grace swerved, dodging, adrenaline spiking. She'd driven through ambushes before. This felt different. The precision of the shots, the timing. They knew her playbook. Whoever was behind this, they weren't just hunting her. They were matching her. Back in the U.S., stood alone in his office, the night pressing hard against the windows. He knew he'd just committed career suicide. But he didn't care. He picked up the phone and called an old number, one that hadn't been used in years. Came the voice on the other end. Exhaled, "You still got eyes on Fort?" A pause. "Why?" "Because one of your soldiers is about to do something very stupid." His tone dropped. "Yeah, he's chasing ghosts again, but this time it's not his father." Grace's van finally gave out near the edge of a frozen lake. The engine coughed, died, and fell silent. She sat there for a moment, breathing heavily, hands trembling from adrenaline and exhaustion. Then she heard it, the low hum of approaching engines, snowmobiles. She turned to, "Out now." He could barely move. She dragged him toward the tree line, half carrying him. The cold bit at her wounds, but she didn't slow. As they ducked behind a fallen log, 3 figures emerged from the fog, dressed in black tactical gear, visors down, weapons raised. Grace counted their steps, 12 meters. Then she fired once, precise, clean, hitting the lead operator's leg. He went down screaming. The others fanned out. Snow exploded around her as bullets tore into the ground. She rolled, fired again, hit another. The third returned fire, grazing her side. Pain burned, but she stayed focused. One left. She waited, calm in the chaos. Then from the silence, a voice came through the storm, amplified through a mask. "Grace, you've served well, but you know how this works. You're the liability now." She recognized the voice instantly. Replacement, Director Crane. Her own superior. She shouted back, "You sent men to kill an American agent on foreign soil. That's your liability." Crane's voice was cold. "You shouldn't have taken the file." She smiled grimly. "Then you shouldn't have made me." She fired. The shot cracked through the air. Silence followed. When it cleared, the final figure lay motionless in the snow. Grace lowered her weapon, breathing hard. But even as she caught her breath, a new sound filled the distance, an aircraft engine. Closer, louder. A single plane descending fast. Lance landed the cargo plane on a frozen strip 5 miles out, the tires screaming against ice. The cold slammed into him the moment he stepped outside. He scanned the dark horizon, heart hammering. Then movement, smoke in the distance. He ran. Grace dragged into the forest, blood dripping in the snow. She could barely see straight. Her vision tunneled, her body screaming for rest. But she didn't stop. Because stopping meant dying. And dying meant breaking a promise. She collapsed beside a tree, gasping. His breathing was shallow. "Why?" he whispered. "Why risk it?" Grace's voice was barely audible. "Because someone once did the same for me." Her fingers brushed the dog tag under her collar, his tag cold against her skin. Lance found the van first. The bullet holes, the blood. His pulse spiked. He followed the tracks into the trees, rifle raised, moving low and silent. Training took over. Every sound, every breath mattered. Then in the pale glow of dawn, he saw her, slumped beside a tree, pistol still in hand, blood soaking through her coat. "Grace!" he shouted, sprinting forward. Her eyes fluttered open. For a moment she looked disoriented, then she smiled weakly. "I told you not to come." He knelt beside her, ripping open his medical kit. "You think I take orders well?" She laughed softly, a tired, broken laugh. "You sound like your father." He pressed a bandage to her side. "You're not dying here, not like this." "I'm not dying," she murmured, "just changing chapters." He shook his head. "No, you're coming home." But before he could lift her, stirred weakly. "She saved me," he rasped. "Don't let that be for nothing." Lance looked between them, realization dawning. "What's on that drive?" Grace reached into her pocket, pulling out the flash drive with trembling fingers. "Names," she whispered. "People on both sides, selling secrets, sacrificing soldiers like me for money." Lance's blood ran cold. "You can't take that on alone." She met his gaze. "I don't intend to." She pressed the drive into his hand. "You deliver this to someone who still believes in truth." He hesitated. "That's not how this works." She smiled faintly. "It is now." The sound of engines grew louder again, reinforcements. But this time not hers. Grace looked up. "Go, Lance." He shook his head. "I'm not leaving you." Her tone hardened. "That's an order, Lieutenant." He froze. Then he nodded slowly, tears blurring his vision. "Yes, ma'am." She smiled weakly. "Now you sound like a soldier." He rose, taking the drive, eyes locking on hers one last time. "I'll finish this," he said. "I know," she whispered. "You're your father's son." And with that he turned, disappearing into the storm. Minutes later, the snowmobiles arrived. Grace lifted her weapon again, blood dripping onto the frozen ground. She didn't expect to survive, but she intended to make it costly. The first two agents appeared through the haze. She exhaled, whispered softly, "4," and opened fire. Hours later, miles away, Lance crossed the border carrying the flash drive. Behind him, the storm still raged. Ahead of him, a dawn just beginning to break. He whispered under his breath, "Sometimes the strongest ones are the ones nobody ever believed in." And he kept walking. Because promises don't die with the people who make them. They live on in the ones who keep them alive. What happens after the gunfire stops, and all that's left are the echoes of what you've done. The snowstorm had finally broken. Sunlight pushed through the clouds, spilling over a landscape of ash, ice, and ruin. What had once been forest was now a graveyard of smoke and silence. And somewhere within it, Grace lay still. A medic team found her hours later, unconscious, bleeding, half-frozen, surrounded by bodies. 3 enemy agents dead. 1 pistol empty. 1 woman still breathing. Barely. They didn't know who she was. Not at first. until one of them noticed the tattoo on her neck, the winged skull, the crossed rifles, and the single name beneath it. R. They knew then. They didn't speak her name aloud. They just worked faster. 2 weeks later, in a quiet rehabilitation ward near Air Base, Grace opened her eyes. White ceiling, sterile light, the faint hum of distant engines. She didn't remember collapsing, didn't remember being found. Only fragments, snow, gunfire, the warmth of blood freezing on her skin. And a voice. "You're your father's son." "Lance." She tried to sit up, but pain screamed through her side. A nurse appeared instantly, pressing a gentle hand on her shoulder. "You're safe," the nurse said softly. "You're in Germany." Grace's voice was rough. "How long?" 13 days. Grace closed her eyes, and the others. The nurse hesitated. "You're the only one they brought in alive." Grace said nothing. She didn't flinch. She just looked out the window, watching snow melt off the glass. Her life had always been measured in survival, not in peace. Back in Washington, the storm she'd unleashed was only just beginning. The flash drive had made it. Delivered anonymously by a courier to a trusted journalist, one who knew exactly what to do with information that powerful. By the time the agency realized what had happened, it was too late. Headlines across the world screamed betrayal. Names of officials who'd been selling classified intel to separatist groups appeared on every major outlet. Careers ended overnight. Arrests followed. The story didn't mention her name, but every person who needed to know knew. And somewhere in the middle of it all, Lance watched it unfold from in Virginia. He hadn't seen Grace since that night in the forest. After he'd crossed the border, a contact from his network had picked him up, debriefed him, and told him to disappear. He was officially AWOL. Unofficially, he was a man who'd done something right, even if no one would ever know it. He thought about turning himself in. But when he saw the news, the corruption exposed, the names revealed, he knew what she'd sacrificed was bigger than him, bigger than rules. And for the first time in his life, he felt something his father must have felt once. Purpose. At Grace's recovery was slow. Her body mended faster than her heart. Every night she dreamed of snow, of fire, of Lance disappearing into the storm. She wondered if he'd made it. She wondered if he hated her for making him leave. But most nights she dreamed of. His voice always came last, as if carried by wind. "You did good, Grace." Sometimes that was enough. One morning, Colonel appeared in her hospital doorway. His uniform was immaculate, his face older, lined by years of holding too many secrets. "Permission to enter?" he asked. Grace almost smiled. Since when do colonels ask permission? He stepped in, pulling a chair beside her bed. "They told me you retired," he said. "Then I saw your name on a recovery manifest. You never really quit, do you?" "Quitting isn't in the job description," she said quietly. He nodded, eyes drifting toward the bandage on her shoulder. "They're calling you a ghost again. You know that." "Always were," she murmured. "Just one with better lighting." He smiled faintly, then grew serious. "The agency's cleaning house. Gone underground, Crane been arrested. And the directorate, well, they're pretending you don't exist. Again." "Good," she said. "Makes it easier to disappear." Studied her for a long moment. "You could come home, full reinstatement. Hell, I could make that happen." She looked out the window. "I don't think I have a home anymore, sir." He leaned forward. "Then make one, you've earned that." Grace didn't respond. She just nodded slowly, eyes distant. Before he left, he handed her a sealed envelope. "Found this on my desk. No return address. Figured it was for you." She waited until he was gone before opening it. Inside was a single piece of paper, folded once. "Still alive, made it home. Your file didn't mention how stubborn you are." "Thank you." Well, Grace smiled. For the first time in years, it wasn't the tired smile of someone pretending to be fine. It was real. Months passed. The world moved on. The headlines faded. And Grace disappeared again, this time by choice. She traveled quietly. No agency tail, no mission orders. Just a woman with a small duffel bag, a faded jacket, and a scar she no longer bothered to hide. She ended up somewhere warm, a coastal town with no need for code names or call signs. Her neighbors thought she was a teacher. Sometimes she even believed it. She taught languages to children who'd never seen war. Told them that stories had power, that truth had weight. They never knew what her tattoo meant. They never asked. Back in Virginia, Lance stood before a new group of recruits, his own platoon now. He'd been reinstated quietly, without ceremony. Officially, his record showed extended field assignment. Unofficially, had made sure he was protected. He addressed the soldiers standing before him, 20 pairs of eyes, young, restless, eager. "You'll hear a lot about heroism," he said. "Movies, medals, glory." He paused, looking down at the letter folded in his breast pocket, the one she'd given him months ago. "But that's not what keeps you alive. What keeps you alive is someone watching your back when no one else will. Sometimes they'll wear the same uniform, sometimes they won't." He glanced out the window, sunlight spilling across the field. "And sometimes," he continued softly, "they'll carry a mop instead of a rifle." The recruits smiled, not quite understanding. But that was fine, they would someday. That night after lights out, Lance sat alone in his office. He opened his notebook, one he'd started after returning from Europe. At the top of the page, he'd written a single sentence. "What would my father have done?" Below it he added, "What would Grace do?" He stared at the words, then added a third line. "What will I do?" And for the first time in his life, he knew the answer. He'd lead quietly. He'd protect fiercely. And he'd remember, always, the woman who'd lived invisible so others could stand visible. Half a world away, Grace walked along a quiet pier at sunset. The ocean smelled of salt and freedom. She stopped at the edge, watching the horizon, the water catching gold light like memory. Her phone buzzed once, a message from an unknown number. "Still keeping my promise. You were right, I made captain. Thank you." "Well." She smiled softly, typing one short reply. "Then keep going. The world still needs people who remember why they started." She hit send and watched the message vanish into signal. The wind caught her hair, the sea stretched endlessly ahead. And for the first time, she didn't feel like a ghost. She felt human again. The sun dipped low, the light turning red and soft, the kind of light that hides scars and makes everything look at peace. Grace whispered into the fatting wind, a voice meant for no one in particular. For Lance, for all the ones no one remembers. Then she turned, walking back down the pier, her footsteps fading into the sound of the waves. Years later, somewhere in a military museum, a small glass case was added quietly to a dimly lit corner. Inside, a faded gray uniform, a worn dog tag, and a photograph of a woman with calm eyes. No name, no plaque, just a single engraved line beneath it. Sometimes dignity doesn't speak. It simply acts. And the world, though it may forget her name, will always live in the shadow of the promise she kept. The end.